So at this point, we already achieved quite a lot. But there's one thing which is unrealistic, at least in some applications. Currently, we're always fetching data when this button is pressed. Now, in a lot of applications, you want to fetch data as soon as a certain component loads, right? If a user visits the web page, you immediately want to start fetching data. And currently, we're not doing that here. We're just fetching it on demand when the button is pressed. Now, to immediately fetch it, we can use another concept we already learned about. We can use the useEffect hook. Because sending this HTTP request is a side effect which ultimately changes our component state. And you learned that such side effects should go into useEffect. Having them into a function is of course also fine, as long as you don't just call this function as part of your main component function. Because then you could create an infinite loop where you call this function, it updates the state, the component function re-renders or is re-evaluated, and therefore the function is called again, it updates the state, the component function is called again, and so on. We want to avoid that, and that's why we use useEffect for that. UseEffect is great if we have code that should be executed as part of the component render cycle, but maybe not always when the component re-renders. And therefore here, we can add useEffect and then define our effect function here, either as an arrow function or as a regular function with the function keyword. And here in useEffect, I can of course simply call fetchMoviesHandler. I can simply call this function like this. So now this function is still called if I click the button, but in addition also whenever this component is re-evaluated. Now of course I don't want to call it whenever this component is re-evaluated, because that would be this infinite task which I don't want. Instead we add our second argument here, which is this array of dependencies, where we define when this effect function should be executed again. It will only execute again if the dependencies listed here change. Now as you can clearly tell, I didn't add any dependencies yet. So if I save it like this will never run again except for the very first time the component is loaded. So hence, if we reload this app, the data is fetched immediately. It's still fetched again if I click the button, but it's also fetched immediately when this loads for the first time, because of useEffect. Now technically we're not executing this in a clean way though. You also learned that it is a good practice and a best practice to list all dependencies you use inside of the effect function here in the dependencies array. Now I am referring to the fetchMoviesHandler function here. That is a dependency of this effect. So we should add fetchMoviesHandler, a pointer at this function, as a dependency. Because if this function changes, this effect should be re-executed. And this function could change if we would be using some external state in here. We aren't doing that in this example, but in other examples we could be doing that. So we definitely want to list this function, a pointer at this function, as a dependency of this effect. The problem with that is that functions of course are objects, as you learned, and therefore this function will technically change whenever this component re-renders. So we will create an infinite loop if we add it as a dependency. One solution would be to omit it, because here that would indeed achieve the result we want. But it could introduce subtle bugs if our function would be using some external state. So the better solution is to use the useCallback hook and import that from React and wrap the fetchMoviesHandler with that. For this we need to transform it and turn it into a constant, which saves the result of useCallback, which then wraps this function, which is now written as an arrow function here, though we could also use the function keyword, like this. And we should add our dependencies array for useCallback as well, and list any dependencies this function might have. This function though has no external dependencies. The fetch API is a global browser API, it's not a dependency, and other than that we're not using anything special in here. These state updating functions, as you learned, don't need to be added as dependencies because React guarantees that they will never change. Now, I still changed something which would break the app, I removed the async keyword. We need to bring this back here, simply in front of this anonymous arrow function. Async, then any parameters we might be getting, then arrow, and then the function body. Alternatively, we can also write it in a non-arrow function way like this if we want to. That both works, and there is no difference here. I will go back to the slightly shorter syntax though. So now we ensure that this fetchMoviesHandler function is not recreated unnecessarily. So if we save that, it now crashes though, because the order is now wrong. With the function keyword, it was no problem because of hoisting. Now, since this is a const, calling it before this code has been parsed won't work, so we simply need to move this useEffect call after this function definition. And now it will work again. And it works as before, without an infinite loop, and we still can also reload manually. So that's how we can leverage useEffect to make sure that we send a HTTP request immediately when a component loads, and not just when a button is clicked, though we still can also do that. And you also learned how to use useEffect correctly then, and how to ensure that it will really always run when it needs to run, but not when it does not need to run.